Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of PDs at Sea. I'm extremely happy to be joined today by Dr. Stacy Fairbanks, who has a long and illustrious career in medical education at the graduate medical education level and as a program director. Thank you for joining us, Stacy.
Thank you, Bryan.
We're also old friends from the Society for Education, Anesthesia, and PD scene, commiserators, and we help each other out. Before we get started, would you mind giving us just a recap of your journey, maybe into and then through being a residency program director?
Sure. I trained at OHSU in Portland, Oregon. I graduated what was technically my residency and fellowship in 2012. So I did a neuroanesthesia research fellowship kind of combined into my residency. And I thought I was going to be a neuroanesthesiologist for the rest of my career. My first job out of fellowship was at the University of Colorado, where I was for 9 years. And that's, I think that I knew I really liked education even as a resident and a fellow. I did a lot of medical student education and was always really interested in what our program directors were doing. One of my associate program directors was Dr. Dawn Dillman, who a lot of people in SEA know, and she was just wonderful, and I found her fascinating. And so at the University of Colorado, I was doing research, I was clinical, and then I was also doing education. And I realized during that time that was probably a few too many hats to wear, so I kind of cut back, and I really tried to make education my primary role of what I did when I wasn't in the operating room. So during my time at the University of Colorado, I was the medical director of the AA school and the co-chair of the residency CCC. I took on a lot of roles within the residency program, and I really realized that residency education was something that I valued and loved even more than educating our advanced practice colleagues. And so I was recruited to and offered the position as the residency program director at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And I moved here in 2020, like the middle of the year, right during COVID. And I was program director there for about 3 years. During my time as program director, we made a lot of changes in the program. We introduced holistic application review. When I came to MCW, there wasn't even a DEI committee. So we did a lot of DEI work. I tried to refine the residency curriculum and get the residents some really good protected time. And I really just continue to enjoy mentoring our residents and having a role in education. On a more national level, my educational roles include being faculty on the SEA workshop on teaching. I write questions for the American Board of Anesthesiology. I've done that for probably 10 years now, or maybe more. And I also am the co-chair for the SEA Chief Resident workshop that happens every spring, among other things. And then, as you know, I've worked with you on several workshops, and I try to just learn from all of our really wonderful PD peers as often as possible. And I now am in private practice at a small community hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We serve a lot of underserved patients, and I do primarily OB anesthesia, which I had kind of always had a hand in during my time and done probably 50% or more of OB in the last several years. So that's where I am now.
Well, I just realized we have so many things in common. Obviously, both OB anesthesiologists and graduate medical education. We're actually complete contemporaries. I also started out of training in 2012. I thought it'd be great to have you on to talk to us because program directors face a lot of challenges. And I thought that for someone who recently decided that they were going to move out of medical education, not completely, maybe hear later that you're still dabbling in it, I wanted to hear about your experience and some of the challenges and some of the love. So I guess I'll start out. What made you really love your role, not just as a residency program director, but just being in medical education in general, and that kept you at it for so many years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I love anesthesiology in general. I find it fascinating. I love to learn and continue to keep up my knowledge. And I love learning from other people, which I think is just a natural fit for academics. And I really wanted to help train the future of anesthesiology and help our residents kind of find their passions in the field and fall in love with what we do throughout their training so that they could have long and rewarding careers. So there were a lot of reasons why I particularly liked being the program director. I liked that I got to be a part of all of the big wins that our residents had, both personally and professionally, and then also hopefully guide them through whatever struggles or opportunities they had for improvement. I feel like it's really important that we role model for our trainees, and I felt like I did a good job at that. And so being able to just honor all of the parts about our trainees and the fact that they're human while they're also going through a really intense residency program, I felt like as PD, I could kind of guard some of the humanism that they sometimes feel like they lose during training, and really help them become excellent consultant anesthesiologists. I think for me, some of my favorite memories of being program director aren't any big things, but it's little things like being very deeply touched when my residents would go out of their way to come tell me big news about their life. Like I still remember one of my senior residents saying he needed to talk to me and me thinking, oh no, what is it now? And we went into a call room and he said, my wife's pregnant. I wanted to tell you before I told anybody else in the program. And that was just so touching and cool. And just watching people kind of grow up during their residency was really fun. Going to the weddings of residents and helping the new moms kind of find their way and having all of the different roles that they have to have while they're residents. Those were the really cool, fun times for me as a PD.
All of that 100% resonates with me as well. It is such a rewarding job. I You couldn't have spoken any better for me about why I love doing the job too. But with all of that, we all face challenges. I'm going to start to try to just poke into some of the challenges we face. Um, so, in your experience, the anesthesia residency program interfaces with a lot of the hospital stakeholders. We're dealing with the administration. The administration has its own motivation or goals for why they have residents. The faculty in your department, oftentimes they have different perceptions about what residents should be doing or why they're there. And then obviously patients. Did you find that there was any misalignment between your perception or what you thought your job description was and maybe the goals of the other stakeholders that created challenges in the role?
Definitely. I think though that a really good PD is going to find that misalignment no matter what, because I think that we have kind of more than one boss. I saw my real bosses as being the residents. I felt very accountable to them to provide them with the best education. Although sometimes I felt like maybe those bosses didn't know what was the best education. I can't give everyone every day off that they want or allow them to be out of the operating room by 4 p.m. every single day. And at the same time, my boss was my chair and also the hospital that employed me. And so finding ways to kind of figure out when it was best to advocate for what I felt like the residents needed and make changes, even if it meant that someone was mad at me or didn't like me or um, perceived my decision as a poor decision, was always a challenge. And I think the residency programs are all really unique in the fact that the residents are employees and they're students. And I don't know that there are a lot of jobs out there where you have both of those things coming into play, where you have these trainees who they have certain things that they have to learn during their training. And a lot of that learning will come in the operating room, and yet a lot of that learning also needs to come outside of the operating room in a more didactic type situation, because even if you spend hours and hours and hours in the operating room, there are some things that you just can't learn without interacting with a specific teacher or even interacting with your peers. And so kind of aligning those things can be really tough. the residents need and want the educational experiences, and then the hospital needs and wants their person power to take care of our patients. And I think one of the things that is really tough for program directors is that the ACGME has really high standards for us and for how we manage our program and get the residents everything they need. And all of this is in an environment where the hospital is constantly looking at their bottom line. And I don't know that hospitals were always as money driven as they are now, but it can be really difficult to understand that a hospital has to meet certain budgetary restraints while at the same time knowing that our residents deserve what they kind of paid for in terms of committing to our residency program and thinking they were going to be delivered a certain educational product. And so I think that you're always kind of dealing with this push and pull. And then on top of all of that, we're in an environment where in the operating room, culture and kindness is not always at the best place it should be. And so our residents are siloed. They're in this operating room for many hours every day, sometimes alone, especially if their faculty's burned out and just wants to show up for induction and emergence. And they're trying to learn, but then they're in a place where they don't have a lot of relatedness with the people that they're working with every day. And so that can be its own challenge. I don't know if I fully answered your question, Bryan, but.
Oh, that was great. If you don't mind me asking, you used the word siloed, and it just made me think of something I feel sometimes as a program director. Did you ever feel siloed? Meaning that you had a mission, like you spoke about the residents and your advocate, but sometimes you have to use a little paternalism. Like, I am your advocate, and in being that, I'm doing something that you don't think is the best for you, but I know it is. So you are their advocate, but in a sense, your goal doesn't align with the rest of the faculty or maybe other people in the hospital. Did you ever feel siloed or isolated in the role?
Sure. I think that there were definitely times when I did. It's hard because when the residents are doing a great job, I think it's very easy for the faculty to kind of pat themselves on the back and think, we're doing a really great job training these people. And when a resident's struggling, it's kind of like, you're the program director. What are you going to do for, to make this resident better? Or it looks like you're not doing anything for this resident, when in reality, behind the scenes, you might have an entire plan set up for the resident, but you can't advertise that to the entire department. So there were certainly times when it felt very siloing. The thing that helped me more than anything was having people like you, David Stahl, Don Dillman, Jeff Kirsch was my chair when I was at OHSU, and he was one of the vice chairs at MCW for a bit of the time I was there. And having all of you to talk to and like bounce things off of, or even just get together and laugh about the fact that we can't please anyone, including the ACGME, as much as we try, or that someone on the recruitment message boards called our program a workhorse program for the 25th year in a row, and there's really nothing I can do about it. Things like that. But, yeah, I think that there are definitely times when you can feel siloed in the PD position for sure.
Well, that's a plug for SCA as a source of commiseration and therapy for those looking for it. You brought up some issues that I think anyone in the role is going to recognize as being issues we face all the time. For us, we're trying to educate residents. For the hospital, they're a source of providing care for patients, like they're providing labor needs. So we just went through the COVID pandemic. You decided to start as a program director right before, it sounds like, the COVID pandemic, and it exacerbated a lot of these things. We have this post-COVID staffing shortage. Did you feel that in a meaningful way? And do you think it exacerbated some of the misalignments that you face as a program director?
Yes, I think so for sure. I was very heavily involved in Colorado's residency program as well. And so it's easy for me to kind of compare a before pandemic and after pandemic, although it was two different situations. But the staffing shortage has made it so that our programs or our departments are running on these razor thin margins. And it only takes one sick call to kind of throw off the entire balance of the operating room. And I know that this is happening all over the country, And a lot of the chairs or hospital administrators see residents as the answer to the problem. So if a resident is on an elective or out of the OR on some educational experience, they're seen as usable in many operating rooms. And that shortchanges their education. It increases their risk of burning out because a lot of data shows us that it's not what time you get off of work that really matters or contributes to burnout, but it's knowing that you'll get off by a certain time. And so with these shortages and the patients being sicker and us having a lot of add-ons, I think that it really adds to a lot of resident burnout. And then for program director kind of burnout is that we're constantly monitoring all of that, and we're trying to check in. What time are our residents getting out of the operating room? How much are we using, moonlighting or after hours residents that weren't really on call? And can we rely on our board runner colleagues to protect our residents as much as possible? They have a lot of pressures. They have the charge nurse asking them when rooms can start. They have surgeons coming up and stomping their feet at the board. They have, maybe advanced practice CRNAs who want to go home too. And so how much can we rely on them to kind of guard our residents from being always the kind of person that takes over the room that needs to go later? And then on top of that, you have your faculty who have increased burnout because they're also working harder than they were before the pandemic. And they went through a pandemic where, there were several months, I think you remember, though it's easy for us to forget, where we went to work and we didn't know if it meant we were going to catch a disease that would kill us, in a few weeks later. And so talk about risk for burnout. I mean, all of those things are really tough. But if you have faculty that aren't highly engaged in education in your department, it's then even more difficult to comprehensively train your residents. And the faculty are tired for a reason, but when they only go into the room for intubation, extubation, and then they sign up to give their one lecture a year that they haven't changed since 2010, and it's a PowerPoint, it just makes the job of program director really challenging.
Everything you said sounds like a day in the life of like the past couple of years of my job.
Yeah.
Especially the board runners. We call them coordinators here. They're called board runners at many places. I'll never forget, I had a senior resident who transferred after a surgery internship who had to get her ED rotation. So we decided to just kick it closer to the end of residency. If the ACGME is listening and that's not allowed, I did my best. My board runner called me and said, "Why are you hiding this body from me?" I'm like, they are doing a required ACGME rotation. I'm not hiding anybody. But they do. They see the residents in a very different light from how we do. And it makes it challenging to that in that regard, given what's really unique about our role of a program director. I guess if you could really have the most candid talk you wished you always had, like the one maybe you say to yourself sometimes when you're like really down on how things are going, what would you wish that faculty, or even more importantly, department leadership knew about our role that you get the sense people might not fully appreciate, so that they, so they could really understand where we're coming from?
I'm not sure. I think one of the biggest things is that it's just so important to do perspective taking. Our job is a 24/7 job, but when the stakeholders look at the things that we're trying to do when we advocate for the residents, I hear, how many times have you heard people say things like they think they work hard, but they have no idea what it was like in my day, or I can't believe they only work 80 hours a week, or our residents need to toughen up, etc. And it's also not infrequent that our residents are mistreated in the OR when we aren't there. And so kind of finding it, sometimes I feel like I spent too much time justifying to people above me, or that I was beholden to, why I wanted to protect the residents in this way or that. And so just learning how to perspective take, whether it's for your faculty or your residents. If you're hearing messages that maybe the culture of your OR isn't great, but your answer is, well, everyone's always nice to me, that's not really helpful, because of course they're nice to the CMO of the hospital or the chair of the department. What matters more is that we've got to get people through these residencies. And so if the person who's most responsible for getting our residents through the residencies is coming to you with a problem, it might be a real problem. And so trying to find ways to put yourself in the resident's shoes is maybe more helpful than just kind of denying that there's a problem, or thinking that it's because our residents are missing some sort of key thing that residents used to have 20 years ago, which I don't think is really the case. I think it's just a totally different world. I mean, the days of a lap appy where you're really bored and you're just sitting in the room doing your written charting are completely gone. Our patients are so sick, and the really easy cases don't go to the hospital where our residents are working. And so they're in kind of like a fight or flight mode very, very frequently. And it's just so important to us, for us to acknowledge some of the challenges that they face, instead of just trying to make the residents feel like they no longer have kind of what it takes to be as good of a doctor as we all are, or things like that.
Thank you. I think that was a great answer. Yeah, sometimes I've said to people, everyone else gets to have easy answers, but in my role, I don't get to believe them. I have to find solutions. And I think a lot of people have these, you even said, we've all heard it, these trite answers or responses.
I truly believe, and I see it all over the country when we go to SAAA, PD, et cetera, but the best program directors are the squeaky wheels to their chair or to their hospital administration, or their OR administration. And it probably becomes exhausting to the chair, but it definitely becomes exhausting to the PD. Just like the best chairs are the squeaky wheel to the dean of the medical school. You've got to advocate for your people. And so I'm sure that people would see me coming toward their office and just groan internally. But those are the best people that we have, working for our residents. And we have to value them and try to find ways to, help make their lives or their jobs easier.
Can I get an amen? That is, I can't tell you. I think just yesterday I was telling someone, I wish people would realize that I'm their ally and not, I'm actually being your ally by challenging you. Because
Right.
if I wasn't challenging you, then you'd be in so much more trouble if I let this fly. So amen. Thank you. Do you think, given the position we're in, where we have to, like you just said, really listen, really monitor, and we can't just, have this broadly held view that might not accurately reflect what's going on. Do you think the role of program director places, oh, I guess I'll say us, in that role at a higher risk of burnout compared to other faculty? Not to put us on a pedestal saying we have it so hard, but just honestly, given your experience, do you think we face at least a unique risk of burnout?
Yes. So I was looking up program director burnout recently, because I think, like many of us, I have a coach, and she said, I think that if you weren't burned out, you're extremely, extremely close. And that isn't what I thought was happening when I was going through the decision to leave education. It wasn't because I thought I was a very burned out person, or burned out professionally. But I found a paper that was published in 2011, which is way before COVID, 11 years ago or 12 years ago, that surveyed anesthesiology program directors. And at that time, 52% of the respondents were labeled at being at risk of burnout. And I feel like this is at a time when burnout was not a buzzword. We didn't hear about people being burned out often. And I'm sure that number has only risen. And we know that burnout is kind of characterized by the three big things: emotional exhaustion, low personal accomplishment, and depersonalization. And as more and more pressure is put on program directors to do things like constantly recruit well and also have low program attrition, but do all of this at a time where you should only have holistic program or holistic application reviews, and you shouldn't look at board scores, and all of the dean's letters and letters of recommendation are almost the same. It's sometimes easy to start as a program director overlooking your small wins or your accomplishments and just feel like you aren't personally accomplishing as much as you'd like. And so I think that the program director position is a really high burnout position. It's sometimes a very thankless job, or you have to kind of ride the high of something good happening until another good thing happens. And if that's a long period of time, it can be difficult. I wish I had more answers to preventing that burnout, but I do think that it's on the radar of the ACGME and many DIOs. I just don't know how to make it better.
Well, my motivation for wanting to talk to you is actually to kind of nudge this forward a little bit too. As a program director and talking to people at our professional societies, I can also feel that it's kind of like creeping up. People are facing a lot of challenges. I'm not going to say we face more challenges than people in the past, but I can feel that it's not in a crisis situation, but people are starting to feel pretty stressed out. And in your position of having a little bit of a gap now, having stepped away and having more perspective, I was hoping that you could help to give a nice point of view about what's going on with everything. And I appreciate everything you've said. It was resonated so much. It's kind of therapeutic just to hear someone else talking about it, actually. So I guess just a final question. So now you're on the other side, and you can look back and you have a lot of perspective. I think that when you're not in it, it's actually easier. We don't have that like self-talk that can sometimes be counterproductive. If you were to give advice to someone who's just starting out as a program director, let's say it's a really close personal friend, you really care about them, you want them to be very successful. What are one or two things you would really want them to know about the role, what they were getting into, or just advice in general?
Well, the first thing is I would want to make sure that their motivation for being a program director was basically for the right reasons or pure. It has to be because you feel a calling to kind of serve your trainees and help make their training as good as possible. It can't be because you eventually see yourself as a chair. So for your next step as a program director, or you want to be a vice chair. And so naturally you'll be a PD. It's got to be for the right reasons, or I think that in some way you will fail to succeed, whether it's in the eyes of your trainees or the eyes of your chair. And then I think the next piece of advice I would say is don't just volunteer or take the position willy-nilly. Use the time that you have between taking your position and wanting to say yes, and use it to negotiate with your chair and set yourself up for as much success as you can. So make sure that you and your chair share a vision of how you want the program to look and what that might look like in terms of getting there. And that your chair or your department will support you in that mission, even if it means sometimes doing some hard things. Always your chairs are pulled in 5 different directions, right? They have the educational side in their ear, the clinical side, the research side. But you have to make sure that you're going to be able to have a way to advocate to make your program as good as possible, and that you're not just there to fill a role so that the program can say, this is our chair to the ACGME. And so use your negotiating power to try to mold an environment that is as supportive as possible for your trainees in order to help them thrive. So if you see any large gaps in the program now that you would want changed, find a way to write that into your contract, or to have something in writing that the department is committed to changing this or that for the trainees or for the program. And then I also recommend, at the time of negotiating, a good thing to do is to ask for a leadership coach and have the department support you in that, and for at least a good period of time, 6 months or 12 months, so that as you get to know the role you're in, and if it's a new department, the department you're in, that person can help you navigate some of the difficult conversations you'll have to have as you make change and kind of make the program your own. And I think also just making sure that the program is going to support you in terms of the ACGME required non-clinical time for the program director and the APDs, and that it can't just be, oh yes, we do that, but that it isn't really happening, because that will increase your chance for burnout and make your life more difficult. So I think those would be my biggest things, setting boundaries right away in terms of your personal time versus your work time is so important. but overall, I think that, most people find a way to succeed at this and do a good job. You want to use your bargaining power as much as possible for good in the beginning, because the first year, the first 2 years is when people will listen to you the most. And after that, you're less effective. So really start out figuring out what it is that you need to do and then work toward the change.
Well, as you had said earlier, you lead the workshop for new chief residents, and you're still going to continue doing that. I might suggest that you could actually have a workshop for new program directors too, given your experience. I really appreciate you talking. Honestly, if someone were to ask me questions, what you said is is so much what I would have said. I think you said it much better than I could have. But you've explained my experience as a program director exceptionally well. So I think a lot of people are going to hear what you've spoken about and really relate. I appreciate it. As you said, the ACGME is kind of starting to pay attention to what's going on with the PDs and a lot of the challenges we're facing. I'm feeling it, and that's why I really wanted you to take some time to talk to everyone. I'm very, very happy for you in your new role. And I'm so glad to hear that you're doing great and appreciate all the work that you've done for graduate medical education, the SEA. I happen to know one of your former residents, and I know they really appreciate the work you did. So thank you for all of that, and thank you for spending this time with us.